This is Let Me Sum Up, your regular deep dive into recent reports on climate and energy. I'm Luke Menzel, recording today on Wurundjeri land, and I'm joined, as always, by my two co-hosts. Making her triumphant return, we have Global Vice President for Marketing Extortion and Ethically Sourced T-shirts at the Let Me Sum Up podcast, Frankie Muscovich. Hello, Frankie.
Good afternoon, gentlemen. The listeners can't see my jazz hands, but I'm making my blazing return with the appropriate hand gestures. It's such a delight to be back with you on Gadigal country, as I normally am. And, I'm just chuffed to be back.
And where's the baby, Frankie?
She is currently strapped to my partner at a park down the street, I hope, in what is surely going to be a traumatic event.
We appreciate his service on behalf of all of the Sumerupperers. We, of course, also have a passionate proponent of the culinary delights of the Dungeons and Dragons cookbook, Tennant Reed. G'day, Tennant.
It's an excellent cookbook. It's not hard to be enthusiastic. Actually, both volumes.
Oh, I saw that. There's a new one out.
The Heroes Feast series are excellent, legitimately excellent. There's a lot of thematic cookbooks out there that are just trading off a brand. But Flavors of the Multiverse Volume 2, it's gold.
Check it out, folks. There'll be a link in the show notes. But on this week's show, we go nuclear with a new report that considers the role that small modular reactors could have in Australia's future energy mix. But first, the 28th Conference of Parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change kicks off at the end of November in Dubai, and much of the discussion will revolve around the first global stocktake. The global stocktake is a process set out under the Paris Agreement aimed at assessing progress towards meeting our collective climate goals and highlighting opportunities for ramping up ambition. The technical report that will support political discussions around the global stocktake was released back in September. And while it is the result of a huge amount of work over 2.5 years, it is striking just how familiar many of the issues it raises are. Right, Tennant?
Yes. So there's some reports that have no surprises in them, but it's very important that they be done all the same. And this is very much one of those. So it's assessing progress on all fronts of the commitments made in the Paris Agreement. And it's concluding that the Paris Agreement has driven important action, but much more action is needed now on all fronts. So they go through a lot of the elements, but on emissions, as we all know, the commitments that countries have made are not yet in line with 1.5 degrees. And in fact, action towards those commitments is not yet enough to achieve them. The window's rapidly narrowing. They say all parties need to undertake rapid and deep reductions in greenhouse gas emissions in the decades after peaking, and we need to peak as soon as possible. They say, and these are numbers that we're going to hear more about, although whether they're the same numbers that will emerge out of the eventual decision of the meeting of the parties to the Paris Agreement, who knows? But global emissions need to fall 43% by 2030 and 60% by 2035 versus 2019 levels, not just the 2005 levels that most commitments are pegged against, and hit net zero CO2 by 2050. Net zero global CO2 by 2050 is a tall order. That is not just the rich countries getting there, but everybody collectively on net getting there. That is big. They're also talking about adaptation, where there is more and more happening, but it's fragmented and incremental, sectorally focused, unequally distributed action. In finance, there is more happening. There's this delicate balance in the language about international public finance being a prime enabler, but market finance inevitably needing to be the bulk of the money put to mitigation and adaptation. And one thing that I'll call out, because we've had several fights about this at successive COPs, and I'm sure we're going to have another one this year. There is language in there saying net zero requires systems transformations across all sectors and contexts, including scaling up renewable energy while phasing out all unabated fossil fuels, ending deforestation, reducing non-CO2 emissions, and implementing both supply and demand-side measures. Fossils versus unabated fossils, phase down versus phase out. These are words and combinations that have been going back and forth for a few years now. And for what it's worth, the co-facilitators of the workstream that put this together are going with the formulation phase out all unabated fossil fuels. So sliver in there for the CCS enthusiasts, and we might talk a bit about CCS later, but pretty strong language to me.
And it's pretty reasonable to expect those are going to be some of the most contested parts of the discussion at COP28, right? Especially given that it's being hosted in the UAE, and the person acting as the president being the head of, and we've talked about this gentleman before. He's the head of one of the largest oil companies in the UAE, but has a sort of mixed background of having worked in the environment movement as well. So it's going to be super interesting to see how he, in that role, seeks to sort of navigate and steer that discussion. We should say we're all going to be in Dubai in a couple of weeks' time, observing the goings on. But there's already sort of shots being fired across the bow, if you like, in the media on the role of the UAE in this. I think I saw one article, sort of exposing the flaring of gas in fields owned by that company that the president works for. So I think there's already some stirrings about the potential conflicts there and what that's going to mean for the discussions.
Having the head of the national oil company in charge of the negotiations strikes many people as deeply weird. I don't know. Give him a chance. We'll see how he does. Others have done worse with different backgrounds, including last year. But there's a lot in here that's not a surprise. What's really open to question is how is everyone going to respond to it?
We've talked in previous conversations amongst ourselves that in this next few years, or at least before 2030, we're going to hit peak emissions. Like that will happen. But for the last couple of years, there's there is this language, we are not on track. There is this ever narrowing window to meet 1.5. And you'd have to think at some point in the next couple of years, it may be in the next 2 or 3 COPs, that there's a call decided on, is shooting for 1.5 still, are we going to maintain that same strength of language, or are we effectively agreeing that that's beyond reach now? And what's the new kind of objective or commitment that we're working towards? And I looked at the media release accompanying the stocktake report, and I think one of the quotes from the person in charge of it was, every fraction of a degree matters, but we're severely off track. So if 1.5 is not, considered feasible anymore, what's the evolution of that language look like? Do you both have thoughts on that?
I think you've put your finger on the thing that I've been really thinking about is what the impact of this report is kind of on the meta discourse around 1.5 and what we're shooting for. The purpose of this whole process, and this is kind of like very much embedded in the whole Paris Agreement, is to create these moments where people come together and ratchet up and ramp up their ambition, right? And so to the degree that there's a gap between what we say we want to achieve and what we're actually doing, this is supposed to be a theatre in which that conversation is had, and it's not supposed to be a point which we sort of throw up our hands and go, oh well, it's all a bit hard. It's supposed to be a point where we all we all come together in a moment of increased ambition and redoubling our efforts. It would be really fascinating to see whether, what the folk that framed this process imagined would happen, in fact does happen, because it is pretty sobering when you look at some of the numbers in there. And as you say, Tennant, 43% emissions reduction by 2030 against 2019 levels is a very long way from where we're headed. And 2030 ain't that far away. And so it is easy to imagine that the response is, well, that's just not going to happen. So what are we going to do instead?
Yes.
And then, this goes back to something that we've talked about on the pod before. Well, how do you sort of frame the instead bit with 1.5 when the next target needs to be like the next increment up from 1.5, or which is like 1.6 or 1.7? You've got to maintain that sense of the how critical it is not to let things just slide.
Yeah. And there's a lot of issues here. So there was a paper released a couple of weeks ago as we speak, which maybe we'll consider in a future episode, I don't know, from a group of highly reputable climate scientists arguing that basically the calculation, the consensus calculation in the recent IPCC summary report of the remaining carbon budget consistent with 1.5 degrees is overstated because of the handling of, I think, atmospheric aerosols were a part of the cause there. And they argue that the budget is half. The remaining budget is half what we thought it was. And is that right? I don't know. There are a lot of climate scientists out there, and it takes a while for them to really come to a consensus. I guess we'll see. I remember on the sidelines of the Paris Agreement bumping into an unthinkably eminent climate person who will remain nameless, but who privately commented as the push for a 1.5 degree target was entering from some people's point of view left field at that meeting. There'd been a lot of discussion about 2 degrees in the lead up to that, and there was a push from small island states and others for 1.5 degrees to be in there. This guy thought 1.5 degrees, in 2015, thought 1.5 degrees was absurd. We had no chance whatsoever of meeting it. What on earth was this on about? Personally, I think that the construct of 1.5, even if the budget turns out now to be unfeasible, has done a lot to accelerate action and raise commitments beyond what they would have been. The idea of the Overton window of the thinkable is often exaggerated or misused to introduce things. Try to introduce really extreme things to the discourse to try and move where the centre point is, which may actually turn off as many people as it makes go, oh, a more moderate version sounds good. But I think 1.5 degrees has played an important role. I think it's also still pretty important to pursue. But the question that's going to be in front of us all in these meetings and elsewhere is, well, what coherent way of pursuing this do we take? Because you could just double down on, well, we're going to keep raising pre-2030 ambition until we get to a global, not just countries like Australia saying, 42%. We raise that to 43%. Well, it's the wrong base year, and you would need rich countries almost certainly going faster than that. Do we keep doubling down on that? That's tough. Do we accept that, yes, we're not going to make it without overshoot, but formally recognise and commit to an overshoot pathway where we're going beyond the budget, but we're paying back the carbon budget later. We're going to net negative emissions globally after net zero. That's tough and a huge commitment. Do we start talking about sticking to 1.5 by supplementing mitigation with geoengineering, where we haven't the faintest idea really of what we're doing, except we know that the law of unintended consequences is guaranteed to be invoked? Or do we accept that 1.5 is missed and accept the consequences of that, which will be pretty bad? None of those is an easy choice, and just kind of positively saying, "Oh well, we'll keep trying," but not really committing to any of those very difficult things isn't going to get us very far. So I don't know that this is all going to be resolved this year. I think the stocktake is putting the impetus for these issues on the table, and I think processing that into the next wave of action in whichever of these directions it goes is going to take a while.
And importantly, in the practical sort of next steps context, the next round of nationally determined contributions, which are due in the next 12, 18 months, right?
Yep.
Just to inject some positivity into this, there was a little bit of language in this technical report which stood out to me, and it sort of it makes the point in the guts of it that we have a lot of the technology we need for really significant mitigation, and that the challenges we face around, scaling up deployment rapidly, and they use the language of creativity and innovation in policy making and international cooperation, and they say that that's what's needed to overcome the barriers to climate action. And I think that's something to reflect on. It is certainly the case, and I think we can state quite definitively, if we keep doing what we have been doing, we're not going to hit these targets. But we have the opportunity to do something different, to think more creatively, to consider options that have hitherto been regarded as too difficult or unpalatable. And so, if we're to take on the challenge of this technical report in the way that I think it is intended, it's to kind of break through some of those self-imposed barriers about what's possible. And if we do that, perhaps we can make some of those broader, higher-level discussions a little bit easier down the track, Tennant.
Well, embracing hitherto unthinkable options because they've been too difficult in order to confront creatively and innovatively the challenges in front of us. That sounds like a link to our main event.
Sure does. Love it.
That is true. Nice segue. I think we can say this is going to be the one of the things that we're going to be keeping a close eye on. As Frankie says, the three of us are once again making our way to the Conference of Parties as observers, and I believe that the very next episode of this podcast will be recorded from Dubai. So I'll be able to give you some on-the-ground reflections of how some of these debates are playing out. Shall we chat about that subtly foreshadowed report?
We shall.
Nuclear energy has long been a controversial topic in Australia, attracting passionate advocates and opponents. Critics highlight very long construction timelines, safety concerns, and lukewarm public support. However, it is the relative economics of nuclear energy that have been truly decisive in keeping this technology off the table. Historically, it was cheap coal and gas that priced nuclear out of the market, but these days it is renewable energy paired with various forms of storage that is widely regarded as the lower-cost alternative to traditional nuclear power plants. But what about small modular reactors? Some federal politicians have jumped onto the SMR bandwagon and are touting these smaller, less complex nuclear power plants as an alternative to a large-scale rollout of renewables, a position that is strongly contested by the Australian government. It is a lively debate, and one which a relatively new think tank, the Blueprint Institute, has waded into with what it describes as a critical analysis of the potential role of nuclear energy in Australia. Frankie, what did you make of it?
Well, I think we were, all three of us, keenly anticipating a spicy report on nuclear. And I think it's fair to say at the outset, far from being the spicy curry we might have expected, it's a little bit more like the yogurt-based accompaniment, and it plays
Soothing.
I think it's soothing because I think there's something in this for everyone. If possible, it plays the deadest of dead bats on one of the most.
I'm not sure that the Blueprint Institute is going for the rater of energy and climate policy.
It's not, but I think it's setting expectations at the outset. You know, does it swing heavily in one direction or the other? No, it doesn't. And that's probably useful to say before we dive into the guts of it. This was fascinating, and to me, read almost like two different reports, or there were two kind of big buckets or chunks to it for mine. One, and this is sort of more towards the back end of the report, is what I think is a really handy explainer or 101 on where nuclear technology is at today. It breaks down the status of conventional nuclear, some of the history of it, sort of an assessment of why we're not really projecting a big increase in new conventional nuclear. Looking into the future, it talks about SMRs and you know, for proponents is probably a fairly devastating takedown of that technology's, potential to ramp up quickly, if ever. And it also touches on, the exciting prospect of fusion reactors. So I think that's like a very handy explainer for people who aren't familiar with this technology. It's, reasonably, if not down on, takes a pretty clear-eyed, I think, look at the potential of those different technologies, particularly SMR being the focus of the paper. And then the first part of the report is an economic analysis based on a model of a fully decarbonised NEM, National Electricity Market in 2050 by looking at the mix of technologies that would be in place to achieve that full decarbonisation without limitations on technology and transmission. And I think because of some of the assumptions it makes, and I'm sure we're going to get into that, it finds a potential role for nuclear in a fully decarbonised NEM, we'll get into that. But the sort of the guts of that is that variable renewables and storage and all of that's going to take you so far, and then there are diminishing returns from building out more variable renewables. We need clean firming to get us all the rest of the way, and this report's authors contend that should be nuclear SMRs. What do you guys think? Do you agree that nuclear SMR is the answer to that particular question or conundrum?
Whether it's the answer probably depends what question you're asking.
Yeah.
Important thing to note is that the authors are incredibly careful right up the front of this report to say, hey team, we're not saying that SMRs are going to do very much in the next 10, 15 years. We have this big task of replacing all of this generation capacity that has previously been provided largely by coal. The technology that's available to do that right now is renewables with firming technologies, and we just need to go like the clappers to replace that. And there is no other plausible pathway for Australia. It's very, very clear on that, and it's very clear that they're talking about a more distant issue, which is how one runs a very high penetration renewable energy grid post 2040. And so, the question there is, well, once you get past 90% renewables, do you just keep ratcheting up that number to 95, 98, 99, relying on overbuild of renewables potentially and very large amounts of storage, or do you bring in some other sort of technologies with different characteristics, one of which could be SMRs, but there's also other things that could play that role. And so I think it's interesting in that it is trying to sort of I think, grapple in good faith with the questions around nuclear, but firmly place them off in the distant future, partly because of the kind of the desktop analysis that they flag, which I agree with you, Frank, is a pretty good sort of primer on the state of SMR technologies, is actually incredibly pessimistic about the current state of the market,
Yes.
right?
Yeah,
There's no plausible way that
so.
they could play any role before 2040, which is quite some distance to the way that they're currently characterised by some in public debate.
The description of the issues facing new nuclear is sufficiently open to various critiques and problems. You could take away the view that it's quite possible that SMRs actually will never be a relevant thing. There's one paragraph in there that I thought was particularly devastating for people who are very enthusiastic. They say China and Russia are home to the only operational SMRs. The Russian modules were completed 9 years later than originally scheduled, and their performance has been described as mediocre. China connected the world's first SMR to the grid in 2021, 5 years behind schedule. The module was shut down after only a few days. The general lack of transparency surrounding the Chinese nuclear program means that the reasons for the shutdown are unknown.
So I would argue that means it does not qualify as an operational SMR if it's immediately shut down.
It started. It didn't blow up.
No.
That's a low bar.
And then you add to that, though, the recent news, which I think is that the most advanced prototype or project on the way in a democratic country in the US, the NuScale one in Utah, was just cancelled. And that was, obviously immediately jumped on by critics of the technology. But, in fairness, that is also a significant development and blow to the economics of SMRs. I think earlier in the year I might have used one of my one more things to talk about the announcement from NuScale that their target price for the output power of the plant had jumped over 50% in recent times, and so that sort of continued. And we did say we'd relook at that, and here we are in November, and the project's been cancelled.
And it was what happened there is like a very unsurprising thing with a capital-intensive, newish technology that experiences an inflationary environment with rising interest rates. The cost expected to be achieved went up. Some of the customers said, "Oh, too rich for my blood, I'm out," raising costs for the remaining customers, causing more to leave, causing more. So it's just a vicious cycle. And in one sense, well, that's a thing that can happen to any technology or any project. But also, I think it really drives home that these are not magical new game changer technologies that are immune to the kinds of challenges that everything else has. They may come good over time. They may not come good. And so I'm going to differ slightly Luke, you said this has got its eye on the far future, well, the 2040s and beyond challenge of an ultra-high decarbonised grid. I mean, yes, it does, but I think it's also written very much with an eye to political and policy challenges right now around the deployment of the transmission infrastructure to support the very large volume of renewables that any fair-eyed effort to model the future of our energy system involves a boatload of renewables, whether it's a 90% of the system boatload or a 99% or whatever, a lot. That deployment is politically running into some troubles at the moment, and one of the reasons for that is that a bunch of people reckon, we don't need it. We can just deploy all these SMRs. It's going to be great.
And I think that completely ignores the fact that, we'll talk about the fact that obviously it's still illegal to be opening nuclear plants in Australia. I think we're the only G20 country with a legislated ban on them.
Thanks to John Howard, right?
Yeah, and
Yes.
it's like put aside the fact that it's illegal. There are just that small consideration aside. When you talk about challenges with transmission rollout, it's not as though nuclear doesn't have very similar or, more challenges that it would need to overcome that will take significant periods of time and investment from governments and proponents to chip away at in terms of the public dialogue. It's not just, the fact of the technology cost coming down sufficiently, which has a big question mark over it anyway. It's how do we, appropriately deal with safety concerns? It's how do you identify sites, that are going to be palatable to the community to host those plants? It's the question of dealing with the waste afterwards. If you think the transmission, problem is a tough nut to crack, nuclear has, a lot more things going on there that are going to require a lot of time to deal with.
And some people have said, we did a survey and there was majority or bare majority support for nuclear. And, those surveys may well be right. But the social license problems are not about majority opinion. They are about highly activated minorities. And I'm very confident that there's going to be some highly activated minorities on this question. So the report has some ideas here. Maybe we should actually run through their recommendations because they're interesting and they are much more open to nuclear than the review of the characteristics of nuclear itself would suggest.
And I think that their openness, Tenet, sort of maybe to square the circle between your point and my point. Like I do think they're focused on the far future, on the 2040s plus, but that is a very strategic decision to try and build literacy around that fact in the current debate. I think that they're trying to kind of raise the level of knowledge. Like, even if we're very generous to SMRs and say, well, yes, they could play this role and there's a potentially useful role given this modelling that we've undertaken in a high penetration renewable energy system, that is a way away. And in the meantime, we need to be building a lot of renewables. And so I think you can squint at this and see, well, the attempt to build some sort of consensus that says, well, yes, we'll build the renewables and we'll also start just testing the waters, softening the ground for a potential future nuclear energy industry in Australia. And that's really what these recommendations speak to, right? So number one, lift the ban on nuclear generation in Australia. The number two, commit further to building capacity of renewables in recognition of the fact that they're the lowest cost decarbonised grid. So that's that kind of like, it's almost the grand bargain one could see playing out across, the spectrum of political interests that are kind of engaged in this debate. And that would be a pretty big win for renewables, I would have thought, if that consensus was established.
And a win for nuclear too.
Yeah.
Like a lifting the ban would be a major thing. I think as we've said in past episodes, and as this report makes not quite as clear as it could, but pretty clear, you would need to do a lot of other stuff for nuclear then to actually happen. And the bit that they don't have a recommendation on is how do you establish a market and set of policies that would enable it to happen?
Well, I think in the body of the report, not in the recommendations, it's effectively saying we shouldn't really do much of that sort of stuff until we actually see that it works overseas.
Yes.
Yeah.
So they're kind of just like, let's do some preparatory work. Let's just make sure we're not entirely caught on the hop if this thing sort of takes off in other places around the world, which are making, significant investments. There are, something in the region of 70 odd, various attempts all supported by government to get SMRs up in different parts of the world. But in the meantime, in Australia, what are we doing? We're running education campaigns around the safety and potential role of nuclear. We're initiating community engagement programs to acquire social license for SMR sites. And then there's some kind of like very, let's get a department to do some reports around long-term radioactive waste disposal and then commence feasibility studies so that we've got some background information and thinking that we can leverage if we at some point, in the future want to scale this up, right? Yeah. So it's very softly. Once you get past that initial sort of step of revoking the ban, everything else after that is, a bit warm and fuzzy, if I can put it that way.
Yeah, well, I think it makes the point very effectively that we should be wanting to avoid ideological opposition to technologies or dismiss them out of hand. Like I think, we do that at our own peril. If we don't do a lot of like these recommendations, you could characterize as no to low regrets kind of measures that we could prudently take now in the event, potentially unlikely, such as it is, that costs do come down overseas. And, I don't think anyone is pretending that Australia would pioneer this technology to get this kind of thing on a learning curve is going to require, as we always bang on about, deployment at a scale that we're not seeing anywhere yet, but would require, I think, the big powers of the US and some of those other countries to really go big on if you're going to see costs come down to the extent they need to for it to be a thing.
Well, when your installed base is nothing, the first doubling or two is quite easy. Maybe we could get in on the ground floor, but you're right. We couldn't, with our scale of electricity demand, make a very large contribution to the total sweep of global deployment and cost decline that might follow, although there hasn't been. There's an interesting paper cited in there about the lack of an overall exciting learning rate for nuclear technology over the past few decades. I dug up that report, and it is full of pining by the very pro-nuclear author for the learning rates that were achieved in the 1950s and first half of the 1960s. And if only we could go back to that rather than the doldrums and depression of the late 60s through to now, everything would be great and the world would run on just about nothing but nuclear electricity. Yeah.
And actually, this report also raises a really interesting potential conundrum along those lines as well, because it laments the fact that conventional nuclear is only really seeing costs increase in recent years rather than decrease. It then talks about this potential competition for investment, right? So ultimately, the rollout of nuclear is not going to happen supported by governments. Like, this isn't going to be a thing that governments will nationalise and be responsible for that kind of learning rate and mass deployment achieved. We will need private investment into the technology. And so whilst we're in this position where, there are some early stage pilots of SMRs happening or being cancelled or, sort of bumbling along, the technology of fusion reaction is getting quite a lot of early interest from investors. And so there's the potential that if you see fusion nuclear get to an exciting enough point in the R&D phase that's like, yep, that's commercially scalable, it could cannibalize potential investment that might otherwise go towards SMRs. And so you might never see that take off. And then fusion becomes the thing. And, that might be a much more sort of distant prospect of getting up as well.
Yeah, it could have that effect even if there is never a commercial megawatt hour of fusion electricity generated.
That's right.
If you're just sucking up all the excitement in the venture capital community, Absolutely. And there has been some excitement in recent years, although the paper notes just how far the fusion ignition experiment that was so exciting recently, how far that is from doing anything useful for an electricity system, which is quite far, decadally far.
Which sort of goes to scepticism I have on a couple of these recommendations in terms of the timelines that we're talking about for some of this stuff coming online. Like, I was trying to put myself in a position of a government that was going to start designing education campaigns and initiating community engagement programs about a nascent technology which nobody is particularly confident is ever going to turn up. Like, how do you go and have those conversations? How do you run education campaigns about small modular reactors?
That don't exist
talk
yet
about
at any scale.
The great shakes that are emerging in China and Russia on the SMR front. I mean, it's not a thing. Like, how can you do that? I can sort of squint and see, well, sure, we could lift the ban and you could start doing some feasibility studies and so forth. Like, okay, I mean, that doesn't seem like a crazy thing to do. But I'm just not sure. It sort of very much confuses the conversation that we're trying to have while we're simultaneously trying to kind of really bring a whole bunch of communities right around the country on this really tough journey around, offshore wind, onshore wind, solar, transmission lines, all this stuff that needs to be built really quickly. And then there's this other random conversation we're having on the side about maybe we're going to build SMRs here in like 20 years. Like, I don't know, that doesn't seem like a very coherent conversation to have with the public. And it could actually be actively confusing and hurt, the conversations you're needing to have around transmission lines and the like, because they'll go, well, aren't you building SMRs later on? I heard you saying that in the other campaign. Like, how does that even work?
I think you're spot on with one of the, I think, criticisms you could level at, wanting to start education campaigns or community engagement now on SMRs at, with one, like the opportunity cost of pursuing that alongside or, diverting resources away from like what are real challenges right now with the rollout of transmission and more renewables. Yeah, I see, like, I could completely see like that situation where you're confusing the general public, particularly when there's not like something tangible to actually point to on like, this is what they look like.
So we should maybe go back slightly to the motivator, well, one of the two motivators, the explicit motivator in the paper for why you would bother with doing all this prep work for something that might not pan out and run the risk of confusion or just, wasting people's time while there are urgent things to do. And that is the modelling findings about the relative costs of a technology-limited versus a technology-inclusive electricity system. Now, they've got a particular model that they've borrowed. So the authors of this paper, the direct authors of this paper, they're not modelers, they're not energy systems people, they're policy people broadly, but they've consulted with a couple of energy modelers. And they've got a particular model. It's the MEGS model. It's a different model to the ones that are used for the integrated system plan or many other purposes. You can get into the guts of it and say, oh, I don't agree with this input assumption, or like nuclear bros will not like that it uses capital cost assumptions from the latest GenCost. Our good friends at CSIRO did some numbers that weren't super flattering for nuclear. I think like those numbers are like pretty consistent with the project that just got cancelled, for instance. Yep. But anyway, you can get into the guts of it and you can argue about the approach in various nuanced ways. But the broad finding is very consistent with a lot of exercises, which is that the costs of a highly renewable energy-based system really start to accelerate as you get closer and closer to 100% primary generation coming from variable renewables, because you're overbuilding so much something to deal with the variability, and especially the rare variability. And so you need something, and you can avoid a lot of overbuild and other resources if you've got a little wedge of clean, firm something or other in there.
Agree with all of that. Why nuclear SMRs in particular? Why is that technology seized on in this report as the solution to that firm, clean wedge?
Because it's so hot right now.
So I think,
But not super critical.
oh snap!
It'll be hot for a while. About 1 million years. It's fine. It's very manageable.
Maybe. Well, but I think maybe that's the biggest flaw, I think, in this paper or the analysis, that it kind of presupposes that nuclear SMRs are the only technology solution to that particular problem.
Well, they have fossil generation with CCS in there too. And
yes,
that, like excluding that, the really huge cost impacts that they model only come when you exclude both CCS and nuclear at the same time. And then things really go crazy in their numbers.
Yeah.
You can quibble with all of that. You can have a broader list of technologies to look at. There's people in the States who are super excited about new generation geothermal that's taking all the learnings from the US fracking industry and using it for renewable heat instead of for producing gas. And you could sketch any number of things that could play this role. I think the point that they make, I mean, it may be like the least nuclear enthusiastic version of it would be to say, actually, we don't really know which technologies are going to pan out and which aren't. And it would behoove us not to be ruling any of them out at this stage, because we're pretty confident we're going to need something in addition to onshore wind, onshore solar, pumped hydro, and batteries of various sorts, and gas peakers that are unabated, which play an important role in this model and in the ISP.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I wouldn't put myself at all firmly on one side or the other of this. I'm like, just another one of those grubby centrists on this question. But I do think it would have added more legitimacy to this report if they pointed that out, because SMR technology is so nascent and the costs are still so high, it could compete with any number of other potential technologies that are a riff on, potentially conventional existing technologies like hydrogen turbines. Yeah, peakers and turbines. Yeah. And I think one of the assumptions that they've made in this analysis, has kind of precluded that one way or the other. They also say that they've sort of very firmly focused in this analysis on the decarbonisation of the NEM and the electricity system. It doesn't take into account decarbonisation of the broader economy, like of industry, of transport, like other sectors of the economy where, things like hydrogen will have presumably a greater role to play, and therefore could be technologies where you jump on the learning rates associated with deployment in those sectors, and that then comes into more favourable consideration into a model like this. So for mine, I would have liked to see a little bit more clarity in the way they discuss nuclear SMRs in the mix with other potential technologies. I don't think it at all takes away from the considered nature of some of the recommendations.
I think it goes to your point I think you made at the outset, Frankie, which is it's kind of like two different reports. It's kind of like a short, sharp review of the current state of SMRs and the kind of stock we should be putting in them. And if you just read that bit, you go, not too excited about that. But then there's this other bit which they put up front, which is the modelling, which kind of is kind of presupposing that there is some kind of role for this technology. And you go, oh, this seems really important, and it's going to be bananas expensive if we don't have SMRs post 2040. And so maybe we should be, doing a bit more on this. And there's a little bit of cognitive dissonance across the report. I think the recommendations seem reasonable given the overarching content that is inside the report. Like, they don't overreach in terms of like what they're actually recommending governments do. But yes, there's some tensions in the argumentation for sure.
So the report is suggestive of, it doesn't actually discuss the politics really at all.
It criticises both sides of politics equally at one point.
Oh, yes, that's true. That's true. Absolutely. Like the capital P politics. It talks about how people think about things, but it's suggestive of the potential for a grand bargain in which the current federal government and the sort of centre-left more broadly would agree to ease up on its current vehement dislike of nuclear on non-economic grounds broadly, remove the ban and do some good faith preparatory steps. And in return, the current federal opposition and the centre-right more broadly would agree to grudgingly through to enthusiastically facilitate the deployment of a bunch of renewables and transmission that is, even on the pro-nuclear model scenarios here, still needed as a large part, if not all of, the final energy system that it will give people the lowest bills. I have two questions for you both about that grand bargain. One, if you were the government, would you give it a go? And two, do you think that it would actually be likely to hang together on the other side of things? Was this a deal that the federal opposition might take? Who wants to dive on either of those hand grenades?
I mean, I think that we maintain ideological opposition to different technologies at our peril, and so to not to dismiss them out of hand or to have barriers that couldn't be quickly overcome if, say, the technology costs came down and, my goodness, we want to be SMR central, and then had to start from scratch when it was going to be too late. I think that's an admirable objective, and it would neutralise the point of difference between the two major parties if they agreed to lift the ban. That would be a very, I think, generous demonstration of potential a bipartisan route. Do I think it would hold up? Well, the skeptic in me says that the opposition's taken on this issue to stoke and highlight a division between the two, and to have an argument about something over here when potentially they don't have too much else to say about a lot of the other things that need to happen in the next little while. Well, we don't see the coalition commenting or focusing too much on, like, what absolutely needs to happen, which is deep decarbonisation across the whole rest of the economy. They're very keen on having this discussion. So my view would be that they still want to be having a fight about something.
I think I would have a go at the deal. And the most, taking a sceptical eye to the likelihood of the deal being reciprocated, I think the fact that there isn't currently anything much in the policy armoury for the energy piece of the alternative government other than lift the ban, you could see lifting the ban as a bit of jiu-jitsu. To work with your opponent's momentum and unbalance them. Because what does come next? What would be the policy steps that would, if somebody was inclined to say, oh, stuff all this education business, we're not about feasibility studies, we're about rolling up our sleeves and making things happen in the kind of manly way that men of a certain age who will bend your ear about nuclear power, who are not the only people who are supportive of nuclear power. Nuclear youth are real. You are seen. But that's certainly one genre. If you were then going to confront the questions, how do you make something happen? Geez, that takes you into some difficult conversations. Because, like what? I've heard a member of the federal front bench for the coalition talk about the potential for a technology-neutral capacity mechanism of the sort they were developing when they were last in office to underpin new nuclear.
So is that technology neutral between SMRs, conventional reactors, and fusion? Because some nuclear would get up in that scenario.
Well, you would have to rule some things out of that mechanism because if you didn't, unabated gas would kill it, because unabated gas peakers offer dispatchable capacity for about like $1 a watt, and nuclear offers capacity at insert guesstimate here if it's SMRs and 6 to 9 to 12 to see where your project cost runaway gets to dollars per watt for conventional nuclear. So you'd need something equivalent to a honking big carbon price in there. These are not easy. I mean, hey, I'm here any day of the week to talk about design of carbon prices or equivalent policies for the electricity sector. But boy, that's a complex one for the federal opposition. All of which is to say, if the ban is lifted, that is perfectly rational and not exactly rolling over and surrendering to anything particularly unwise happening. And we do have a serious need for more technologies to bring to bear on managing a fully decarbonised electricity system.
I just think we need to acknowledge that there is a broader contextual complexity in this space that sits outside of energy and climate debates, which is the long-standing anti-nuclear movement in Australia. Like, as soon as you do this, you're opening up a whole nother front of debate. Yes, you make one side of politics happy. You make another bunch of people really, really, really unhappy. And this is not like a clean win to go down this path. It might help with building some consensus in the centre of politics, potentially, but I think the government would have issues even within its own ranks if it was to try to pursue this policy. So, yeah, you can kind of have a theoretical conversation about, oh, yeah, this would be a nice way of building some consensus across party lines, but there are lots of issues that one would need to navigate and new fronts of debate that would be opened up that one would have to, if one was in the hot seat, think very carefully about.
Yes. And if there's one thing that the public discussion of nuclear energy in Australia does not deal with particularly well, it is nuance. In my day job, very carefully parsed and worded things to say, and nobody has got the nuances. People have just had immediate, strong, visceral reactions to the words. So it is. I recognise what you say, Luke. It's a very difficult conversation to try to execute delicate manoeuvres in. I will say one more thing, actually, which is that one argument that's been put to me about, well, would you really need to bother with anything like nuclear or CCS in the power system? The argument is, we'll just build a bunch of renewables and that'll be fine, and we'll have some unabated gas peakers and we'll plant some trees. And not everybody will find that plan convincing. And if you don't find that convincing, then you want something different. on the how do you deal with the last couple of percent issue. So if so, what? What is it? Maybe it is hydrogen, maybe it's geothermal, maybe it's fusion, maybe it's bioengineered hamsters in their cybernetic hamster wheels. But you need something, and so real problems to be solved.
As always, we close out the show with one more thing in which we all share something that is currently captivating our attention. Frankie, what have you got?
So, not being at work, gainfully employed at the moment, raising a tiny human, I had clocked the school strike for climate as well just a few days ago, and that just sort of had me thinking in connection to another fabulous initiative that I was invited to participate in, which was the Careers for Net Zero campaign. Which, like, we spend so much of our time on this podcast talking about all of the technology solutions that need to be rolled out and the scale of the deployment that's needed. But to enable all of that, we need people doing a lot of this as well. And I think it's sort of one aspect of this challenge that doesn't get nearly enough attention in the day-to-day debate. So that's why I was so delighted to be involved in the launch of that initiative, which is, pitching hard. We need 2 million more people working towards, this transition in a range of different roles. And I was looking at this school strike for climate and thinking there's potentially the future workforce, marching in the streets, asking for strong action. That gives me cause for optimism, and hope to see all of these super passionate people. I was basically looking at it like a recruitment agency. I'll take some of you, because we need also, I think, as you were saying, Luke, earlier, creativity and different approaches to things. And when I look at the new generation and the younger kids coming through, they're not burdened with some of the issues in previous debates. Like, they will bring new energy and new ideas into this transition. So that just gives me a lot of cause for optimism. So one was a shout out to Careers for Net Zero. I had a rollicking good time travelling down to Melbourne to see both of you and participate in that with my little 10-week-old daughter as well, the newest member of the Net Zero workforce. So if you haven't already had a look at it, please do go to careersfornetzero.org.au.
So just to unpack your actual role in this, there's you did a photo shoot and there's a whole article up, and I understand that you've joined the new Careers for Net Zero podcast, sort of explaining the type of job you do and the contribution that's making to net zero. So the specific question I had for you is what your reaction was when you first were scrolling through Instagram and your photo came up as a net zero champion.
I was mortified. I had not thought it through to the full kind of conclusion of the participation in such a campaign. I've got my lovely friends at the Energy Efficiency Council and Clean Energy Council launching this campaign. Will you be the face of policy advisors for this? Of course I will, lovely friends. I will come to a photo shoot when my baby's 3 weeks old and happily accept the photoshopped results that don't seem to show the sleep deprivation on my face that was definitely there. But then I didn't think there would actually be those images parading through various people's socials. So I started getting emails and friends reach out that I hadn't heard from in a while going, saw your face pop up on my Instagram feed. Good stuff. Yeah. So that's, slightly mortifying, but all for a good cause.
And an excellent reason for our listeners to visit careersfornetzero.org.au to see you standing like a superhero gazing into the middle distance, thinking deep policy thoughts. on behalf of future generations.
There are plenty of other reasons, people, Sumerupperers, for you to go to this website, not to see photos of my face.
Great. Tennant, what have you got?
I'm going to take a leaf out of our recent podcast comrade Alison's book and noddily pick two things, having claimed I was going to do just one. One, just briefly, is that the carbon leakage review, about which I have said things and will say more things, has got an issues paper out. Get on it. It's only open till the 12th of December 2023, and it raises a lot of interesting issues and questions about how they're going to approach this question of how to prevent carbon leakage. So, some people have looked at that paper and said, oh, this doesn't even think that carbon leakage is real. And some people have looked at it and said, oh, this doesn't even acknowledge that it's gotten cheaper to reduce emissions over the past 15 years. And this could have been written by Treasury people in 2006. Well, there's a bunch of interesting stuff in there anyway. So go have a look at it and tell them what you think is sensible. The other thing that I will mention, though, is something incredibly interesting and maybe the start of many more like it, that happened very recently. Australia and Tuvalu agreed a treaty, the Whalapili Union Treaty, which involves a number of aspects of the relationship, but it involves mobility for the people of Tuvalu, I think around 11,000 citizens of Tuvalu, to live, work and travel in and to Australia, subject to some orderly arrangements. But essentially, whatever the status of Tuvalu is regarding sea level rise, there will be a home for the people of Tuvalu. Now, there's also security aspects of that deal, and there's a geopolitical, geostrategic overlay to it. But I think we're going to see more of this kind of thing with other Pacific islands who, especially to go back to the start of the episode, if 1.5 degrees is not going to be stuck within, and even if we ultimately come back to it, but we bust it on the way through, life's going to be pretty bad on in a bunch of places. One of those places is many Pacific islands, and having a just solution to the problems those people will face, even if it's not quite as just as not having quite so much climate change, thank you, is important. Australia sees itself as a Pacific power. We do need to step up. This is one important step.
Yeah, I was actually really impressed, unsurprised that an Australian government got to the point of having this sort of arrangement with one of our Pacific neighbours. I was a little bit surprised we got there when we did, and as quickly as we did. I think that's a very good thing, and it's interesting the degree to which sort of competition for, partnership in the Pacific might be acting as an accelerant to some of these conversations, that we're getting to a point where we might have got to otherwise, but getting to it a lot quicker because we are looking for that point of differentiation in terms of our engagement with some of our nearest neighbours. All right. Well, my one more thing is a bit of a shout out to a international friend we've got in the country this week. My organisation, the Energy Efficiency Council, is obviously excited about efficient electric homes and rolling them out around the country. It's a big task. Just in Victoria, where I am today, we need to get 1.7 million existing homes off the gas network over the next 15 or 20 years. That's a big job, as we've discussed on the podcast before. One of the countries that is doing a pretty good job in that area is actually Ireland. Ireland, and particularly the Sustainable Energy Authority of Ireland, has been sort of on this journey for a good 12 or 13 years. It has gone through the process of introducing, energy performance certificates, so how well your building performs, your home performs when it comes to energy efficiency. Accredited assessors for those assessments. A really generous grant program. There's in the vicinity of $8 billion euros allocated to housing upgrades in Ireland between now and 2030 in a country that's not too dissimilar in terms of size than Victoria, and also accredited one-stop shops. So in the context of what we discussed on last episode around the SEC roaring into this space, it's super interesting to have Josephine Maguire, who has been leading all that work at the Sustainable Energy Authority of Ireland, with us in Australia this week. She's joining us at a summit that's taking place on Tuesday. But for listeners that didn't get to that summit, she's also interviewed on the Switched On podcast, which Renew Economy runs. She's on one of the recent episodes. So it's a good chat, and you can get a bit of an insight if you're interested in that whole electrification and energy efficiency space, and insight into what they've been up to in Ireland and what we can learn from that experience here in Australia.
Thanks for the hot tip, Luke. I'm going to listen to that with interest. Before I come and meet her, because I'm sure I'm going to have some questions that I want to quiz her on how we might start ramping up our efforts domestically over here. The $8 billion out to 2030 is sounding pretty good.
A Unity ticket with you on that. All right. So that's a podcast, I think. We're all on socials. I understand, Frankie, that Tenet has provided you with a Blue Sky code.
He has.
Have you joined said network yet?
I'm in the early stages of becoming Blue Sky accredited. I have to say, it's serving me up very hipster vibes. I almost expected an oat latte to appear in front of me when I logged in for the
Oat
first
latte
time.
of social networks. I think that's actually
right.
a pretty good description.
Yes. But I think by the time this pod goes live, my bluesky.social will be up too. So join you both in yet another social media platform.
Yes. Well, things continue to darken on the X horizon, whereas on Blue Sky, the most contentious discussion I recently had ended with both of us concluding we should have lunch together and work out our views on this hot topic there. So it seems all very nice so far.
All right. So we have an email address, Frankie. Do you remember it?
Yes, I do. Although,
Well, let's just see about that.
let's just see about that, shall we? Well, Sumerupperers, I have several requests of you, though, at this point. Not only should you send us always your hot takes on our hot takes or suggestions for papers that we should read to mailbag@letmesumup.net.
Flawless.
You should also send us suggestions for a climate adjacent or climate related movie that the three of us should watch for our holiday special this year.
I think we said climate themed. So
Climate themed. Okay.
you have to be able to argue that there's an explicit climate theme in said movie.
It can't just be a movie taking place on a planet with a planet.
Wouldn't
right.
really narrow the field too much for us.
So that wasn't a tough argument last holiday special because we did the explicitly climate themed Don't Look Up. But yep, Tenet has made arguments that we should be doing Soylent Green in the past.
I thought you weren't going to give voice to that in an attempt to suppress the insurgent Soylent Green campaign that you've now opened the door to.
I'm so confident that campaign will never exist that I feel very comfortable name-checking said movie.
Nothing can silence the voice of the people.
We'll just see about that, I guess. But send all of your thoughts, movie suggestions, papers, critiques or otherwise of us and our thoughts to mailbag@letmesumup.net.
And Tenet, we have a website.
We do. At www.letmesumup.net, you will find the entire world-covering archive of episodes of this here pod. You can see everything we've ever done and everything we ever will do in the fullness of time.
Stay tuned for that. For Frankie Muscovich and Tennant Reid, I'm Luke Menzel. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you again soon.
Amazing.
There you go. You're back.
That was fun, guys.
Yeah.
Sorry to do this last minute. I had written myself a note, which I didn't look at. I had wanted to give a shout out to Alison, maybe as part of my one more thing. Can I just do that quickly? And then maybe you could just plop it into the one more thing
Or
bit?
I could just put that as the after show.
Yes. Okay. I love that. Frankie Muscovich, Alison Reeve's #1 fan. She was brilliant, and I had a lot of fun listening along whilst I wasn't able to pod with you the last couple of months. So I just want to say big thanks to Alison. I'm a massive fan, and hopefully her and I get to do this together at some point.
And she will be back.
Yes.
Alison Reeve will return.
In Thunderball.